Almighty and ever-living God, we come before you, Lord, and we just ask you to send your Spirit in a special way upon us here gathered in your name this morning. We ask you to just increase the gifts of faith, hope, and charity that you first planted in us through our baptism. And we ask you to just continue to increase our knowledge and love for you, Lord, so that with the example of James, who is the second voice of Jesus, we may come to live worthy lives with the gospel that we have answered. We ask all of this in the name of Jesus the Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. We still have a little bit in chapter 1, but I kind of put a summary on the board of what we're looking at, and then we'll go back and we'll kind of finish looking at chapter 1. But James has a definitive pattern that he's creating here. He first is going to talk about the problem in the church that he sees of the communities he's writing to, is that they're facing a trial. And specifically the trial they're facing is going to be one of wealth, both for the poor Christians who have been, exiled from their homes, chased out of Jerusalem, no longer have jobs or security or thing like that, but also those Christians that are very wealthy and what they're doing with their wealth. So he starts by talking about a trial, and then he's going to really tell us there's two ways that people are responding. The correct way is to persevere joyfully in faith, and you'll receive perfect wisdom. You'll gain the knowledge of what God has planned and why God is allowing this, because you'll see things with the mind of Christ. Or you'll turn the trial into a temptation. And although he hasn't mentioned them all yet, I'll just put them here ahead of time so you know what the three temptations he sees are. One is that the rich Christians are treating the poor Christians terribly. They're allowing the values of the Greco-Roman world into the church. They're creating hierarchies and such, which Jesus specifically said they couldn't have. And so there's a problem among them in how they're treating the poorer Christians. Then for some of the poor Christians, they're ready to take from the rich by force. They're tired of waiting. They know the kingdom has begun, so why don't they start the great reversal now that's coming? And so he has to kind of cool them down from how they want to deal with the situation of what's happening. And this was huge. You have to realize that in Judea, as a conquered territory and one that had rebelled multiple times, the tax rate was roughly 60%. And it was purposely done that way. It's called an extractive economy. Rome's whole purpose was to destroy the peasant class and basically make them into slave laborers, because the people couldn't pay their rent, their taxes, so they take their land and then they turn around and hire them out to farm their own land for the good of Rome without any pay. And so Herod and the whole Judean government, the high priesthood, they were all collaborators in this whole understanding. And so because of that, we may not really realize, because our knowledge of that time is really just limited to just the Bible. But you have to realize that during Jesus' early life, and it's quiet for about the period of his ministry, but then not too long afterwards it'll pick up again, there are constantly rebellions going on. There are hundreds of thousands of men and whole families living in the wilderness as bandits. That's why so many of Jesus' parables are about people being beat up by bandits, because that's life. Because they've lost their jobs, they're not going to stay around to help Rome, and so they become these bands of criminals, like King David was originally when he first was exiled by Saul. And so it's a horrible situation. Where Jesus probably grew up practicing his trade was Sepphoris. About 3 years prior to when Jesus was about 3 years old, I should say. A man named John of Gischala, a Galilean, rebelled against Rome. And he did it so well in its initial stages that Rome had no inkling it was coming. And so he attacked the garrison at Sepphoris and destroyed it and took the city. And Rome had never lost a garrison on Judean land before, so they responded quickly. with the sending of 3 legions. And the legionnaires leveled the city of Sepphoris, and they killed every human being and animal in the city, man, woman, child, all of them, as an example. So Jesus and the carpenters, why so many carpenters were in that area, there are almost no trees in Jerusalem, or in Judea. You need to realize that. There are no forests. Closest one is Syria. So they were people like Joseph and Jesus. This is 3 miles from Nazareth. So Jesus would have seen the war as a young boy, and that's what he was doing most likely. He was probably building projects for the rebuilding of Sepphoris, which was completed as an entirely Greek, Greco-Roman city-state, with baths, with a hippodrome, with a Colosseum, everything. It was only 3 miles from Nazareth. He knew very much what the Greek culture was like. Remember, the 2 men executed next to him are bandits. That means they're these people that have lost their homes and are attacking against Rome. Some of Jesus' own followers were originally people called the Zealots. The Zealots were a guerrilla movement who murdered Jews who were sympathetic to Rome and hoped one day to fight the Romans. Well, they would. Eventually it would explode and ignite in the year 66 AD, so roughly 30 years after the beginning of the church, and by 72 AD it would be over. Jerusalem would be destroyed, the temple would be leveled, the Jews would be exiled from their land, Masada would fall, and so the whole time of Jesus, everything surrounding it, is a time of constant revolution, all based on financial issues and such. So these poor are simply ready to do what they've been doing for a long time in Judea. And then finally, you have the third group, up there are these Christians that are seeking to have rich patrons for the benefit of the church and to the detriment of the poor. This is something we don't really understand or know about, and that is, in the Roman world, only about the well-to-do, the haves of the Roman world, and I mean Rome, was about 3% of the population, the imperial family and the senatorial families. Then you had a second group that was recognized but were not landholders. They were called the equestrians. And the equestrians, the only way they could sort of show off their wealth was through kind of being a patron of different groups. No matter how much wealth you attained, if you weren't born in the nobility, you could not be a noble, ever. So it didn't matter. You could be wealthier than the emperor, you're still going to be an equestrian. You can't have that title. And it was illegal, it was a law, it was illegal for the nobles to engage in trade, because that's what the equestrians did, to definitely segregate themselves. So what the equestrians would do is they would find groups that wanted patronage, and it was kind of a way to build themselves up all pompously and help out these groups. And a lot of these groups, we get the word college from it, the collegia, were religious. And so they would have a wealthy patron, and the patron would sort of take the group under his wing. He would, women also were often it, because they had no other place they could show their wealth off in Roman society. And so they would take these groups under their wing, and then they would provide lots of finances and benefits for them. And then in return, it was expected that they would do whatever the patron wanted. So if votes came up or things were needed, that's what happened. So what is happening in James's time is that wasn't so much a problem in Judea, because although it's Roman conquered, it's still very much its native population. But as this group has now fled into the Greco-Roman world, what we have is the church is suffering, right? Most of them are very poor. They don't have a lot of money. Their lives are unstable right now. Even other Jews don't necessarily trust them because they're Christian Jews. And so there's that temptation, well, hey, everybody else is doing it, so why don't we look for a wealthy patron to kind of help us out, to ease the burden. And by doing so, one of the things that meant is you had to bring all the values of society in with it. In other words, we take it for granted now because of Christianity, but Christianity is the first movement, at least in the Western world, in which poor and rich actually rubbed elbows as equals. Poor wouldn't even be allowed in most of these places. You would never see them, ever, except on the street. There was no interaction. You didn't even worship at the same temples. They had the temple for the wealthy, temple for the poor. And so the rich would show up, and this is what James is going to talk about in chapter 2. The wealthy would show up, and they treat him like a king, and they overtly dishonor the poor because he kind of expected it. Why do you have these people here with me if you want my money? And so they're falling into a problem. So these are the three issues, but all of them have to do with wealth that James is talking about. And it comes down to who are we serving in the end, God or the world? That's really one of James's big themes. And then at the last thing of chapter 1, he tells us that true saving faith is proven by works of loving service, not by what we say, not by status symbols, not by simply saying I believe in Christ, but actually what do I do? And so that's kind of where the whole of chapter 1 and where it's taking us for the rest of this this letter. But back to chapter 1, let's go ahead and I want to look at verses 22 through 27 to kind of end it. We looked at it, we started to look at it last time, but I want to just kind of touch on it a little bit more again. James says, be doers of the word and not hearers only, deluding yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks at his own face in the mirror. He sees himself, then goes off and promptly forgets what he looked like. But the one who peers into the perfect law of freedom and perseveres, and is not a hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, such a one will be blessed in what he does. So James has this distinction he's making between those who hear and those who do. It's a common Jewish theme throughout the entire Old Testament and later Jewish writing. It's common throughout Jesus' teaching, the whole Bible, that God completely could care less about people who just have confessional faith, it's called. Right? He destroys his own temple in his own land because they're not doing what they're supposed to do. He could care less if they all believe in him. That's not good enough by itself. It's required, but not good enough. He wants people who are doers. And so James is coming from a very long line of Israel's understanding. But more immediately, he's really talking about Jesus. And we've looked at some of the statements of Jesus where he talks about the man who built his house on sand and the man who built his house on rock. Remember, the one who built his house on rock heard the word and acted on it. The man who built his house on sand, he heard the word, but he didn't act on it. So he heard, he's a hearer, he believed, and his was ruined because there was nothing solid to hold it up, and this man's is the ones that endures no matter what. And so James is really talking about the importance of doing the faith is what's important. In later terms, we put it this way: orthopraxy, right action, is more important than orthodoxy, right thinking. And the church believes that, right? Vatican II is quite clear. Many non-Christians will be saved. Well, they clearly don't have this. They don't believe in Jesus. How are they saved? Because they did the works that God asks of human beings. So it's the doing that's more important. And again, that's a Jewish thing coming down through Jesus. What James will talk about later, in this chapter he calls it hearers and doers. In the next chapter he will call it faith alone versus those who have faith works. So James will reject two things, as the church does. James denies that simply doing works can save you. that there has to be some motivation beyond just thinking I can kind of impress God or just follow a checklist. So works alone can't save you. But James would be very clear, faith alone can't save you either. You need to have both for it to be actual, he would say to actually be faith. This he doesn't believe is really even faith. So he uses different terminology, but he's coming to the same idea multiple times. And he uses this example here of a mirror. Now mirrors were not glass in James' time. They were polished silver. That's why that makes sense of why when Paul talks about today, in this world we see indistinctly as in a mirror, but then we'll see face to face. Well, that example doesn't make sense in our modern times because a mirror you see perfectly well in, but not in James and Paul's time. It was always warped a little. But it gave you a good enough idea. And so what he's talking about here, he says, the man who hears is like, looks at his own face in the mirror and then goes off and forgot what he saw. The man who does, the one who peers in the perfect law of freedom and perseveres, is not a hearer but a doer who acts. Now what is James talking about? Well, what he's talking about is the perfect, notice he refers to it as the perfect law of freedom. So there's perfect again. He's talking about the Torah as interpreted by Jesus. When we look at the Sermon on the Mount and the teachings of Christ, two things are reflected back to us, is what James is trying to tell us. We're reflected back what God expects of us to do, and it's reflected back to us all the places where we fail to do that. He says, the person who looks and is able to withstand looking, in other words, who handles the fact, doesn't turn away and wants to hide from the fact that there's so much evil still in them, that person will be blessed. Because they start to act upon it. I know what I need to do, I know where I fail, and now I have to have a plan. I have to start living the faith. I have to start overcoming my sins. The other person who looks and forgets, James is saying, is like the person who comes to Mass. They hear the homily hundreds of times over their life, and it doesn't anything but words. And then they leave, and the other 6 days are exactly the same as all the non-Christians around them. They never take it seriously. They ignore their defects and faults. They don't seek real repentance. They're not in any way trying to put into practice the life that they need to do. And so that's what James is saying. People who just hear, that's worthless. It doesn't mean anything. It's no different than a guest who showed up because they had to be there and they leave. Mass doesn't make any difference to them. But the hearer is the one who listens. What is God saying? What is he asking of me? What does the Lord require? And what do I need to do in order to make that happen? So that's what James is talking about in this examination of the mirror. And how he describes it is interesting too. He says, the perfect law of freedom. It's perfect because it's of Christ and of God. It is the law. It's Torah. That means we have an obligation to do it. It's not something we choose. It's mandatory. But it's freedom. It may sound sort of different at first, but he's telling us this is the only way you're ever going to be free. Is by admitting the failures and then with God's grace seeking to overcome them. That's the way to freedom. If you think by just ignoring them or not doing anything actively, that simply attending Mass and praying a few times makes you holy, James says you've got a big surprise coming at the end. Big surprise. That God will say, oh, that was nice. And remember again, Jesus' last judgment. Never once does Jesus ask anything about their religious practices. Lord, when did we do this? When I was hungry, thirsty, but right? It's very concrete. Serving people. And we'll get to that a little more in chapter 2 in a minute because where James sees this all sort of connected. Now, the last two verses that kind of summarize this part, and they kind of lead right into chapter 2 as well. He says, if anyone thinks he is religious, but does not bridle his tongue, he deceives himself, he deceives his heart, his religion is vain. So the first thing that James tells us is, again, something we don't tend to generally think of at the high list of priorities of our faith. But he basically says, don't lie to yourself. If you can't control what you say, then it shows your heart's not pure as you'd like to think it is. Because as Jesus said, from the fullness of the heart, the mouth speaks. So who are you? You know who you are. Your words describe who you are. So are your words always angry or sarcastic or gossipy or this? That's who you are. You can say lies about yourself and believe them any way you want in your heart. James says it's a lie. Your words will reveal the true colors. Well, for a while we can play nice, right? We all know how to deceive, so we sound good around others, but they'll come out. Because what are the words inside your head going on that you might not say? It's the same words. Right? That's who you are. Because whenever you're squeezed, what comes out? If it's anger, resentment, bitterness, cursing, that's what's inside. That's what's in the heart. If you're able to be accepting, to resign yourself to it, to be peaceful, those things, that's who you are inside. And so James is cautioning us or warning us about something very important. Watch your speech, because it tells so much more about you than you really realize. In fact, he's going to have a whole chapter on it later, chapter 3. So it's a big deal. And remember, Jesus said, for every word you speak on the day of judgment, you'll be judged on. And you'll either be acquitted or condemned. Condemned, just for what you've said. Why? Because it reveals the heart. Right? We have to get out of the idea that if I don't commit a physical act, I haven't sinned. No, that's not the case at all. Jesus made that absolutely clear. Anger is equal to murder. Lust is equal to adultery. You don't have to commit the act. The act just seals it even worse. But you're already a sinner the moment you've broached the one part in your mind. Yes?
Anger is not a sin.
Anger is a sin.
Anger is not a sin.
It's not always a sin. It is a sin.
Anger is not a sin. Jesus was angry in the Bible, what, 100 years
I said it's
ago?
not always a sin, but it is a sin. Kathy, what are the 7 deadly sins?
Anger
Wrath.
in terms
Wrath
of
is
raging
anger.
and wrath. But that's not, mad, sad, glad,
Right.
and frightened are not sins.
Anger can be, because it usually stems from pride.
Rage,
It's not always.
wrath can be a sin. Anger is not a sin.
Wrath and anger, just let me just clarify something. Kathy, in Hebrew and Latin, the word orge is one word. There's no anger versus wrath. It's whatever type. Paul will describe different types, but anger is not always a sin, but anger is a sin. Jesus said, if you're angry with your brother, you've already committed murder in your heart. Okay? Now, yes, we can quibble about what the anger stems from, but your statement is false. Anger can most definitely be a sin.
Anger is a feeling.
Well, we can talk after, well, we can't talk after today, but doesn't
Feelings are
matter.
not sin.
It is a sin.
Feelings come from God. That's
Wow.
why we're made as
Okay.
human beings.
All right, anyway. You're off on that too, because James would call it a desire. He says our desires are the source of our sins. So, anyway. Okay, so the point being that the thought, the desire, is what already keys it off. That was even before Jesus. Because the last 2 of the 10 commandments are desires. If you desire someone's spouse, that still breaks the 10 commandments, even if you didn't commit adultery, which was an earlier commandment. If you desire your neighbor's goods of covetousness, you still break the commands, even if you never actually steal anything, which is a separate commandment. So already in the Decalogue, the 10 commandments, it was already pointed out to Israel that you do not have to commit a physical act in order to sin. It has to get the desire that comes through that you hold on to.
Would
You
that
want
not be
to
the
commit that.
temptation part of it?
Temptation's the desire to want to do it. That's why it's when you latch on to the temptation, when it becomes more than a passing thought. We all have passing thoughts. That's true. We have passing thoughts. Anger, things like that. But when I lay hold of one, I kind of hold on to it for a while, and now I'm going to reflect on it. that's the moment it moves from just being a temptation, which we can't necessarily control, to now I'm consciously choosing to deal with this temptation, right? So someone cuts you off in the street, you have your flash of anger, you might even say something. At that moment,
that
you're,
can't be
at
a
that
sin.
moment you're done. At that moment you're done. But if you hold on to it, and now you're following them, and you're thinking things in your mind, and all kinds of stuff, and this person, now you've made the movement from a temptation or a quick thing to a focused choice. And that's the thing, it's when you make the choice that makes it a problem. Yes?
What about John's gospel where Jesus takes a whip to the money changers at the temple?
Mm-hmm. What about it? It's pretty angry.
That's anger.
Yeah,
Jesus can't sin.
I know. Kathy, I've said 20 times, anger is a sin, but not always a sin.
I think you're saying it wrong. Anger is not a sin unless it comes to destruction, killing people, unless it goes to breaking one of the Mosaic laws.
Okay. That's fine. Okay, so he does the first part, religion is vain. So notice though, the word religious here is the word for worship. So what Jesus called, or what James refers to as religion, the actual term used here is worship. So he's kind of keying in on something here. First of all, we have to be careful because again, culturally, we read terms different than they were. The word religion doesn't mean in the Bible what it means to us. For us, the word religion means someone who practices, has faith, who's a believer. That wasn't the case in the ancient world. The word religion meant the actual act of worship. Even well into the Middle Ages, to be religious did not mean you were holy or pious. To be religious meant you were what? Part of a specific group. Even today we call them what? Religious. So the term religion as we understand it is 1800s on. It's a very different term. So what James is telling us is he's saying your worship, when you go to worship God, your worship is empty. It's not doing anything. And that stems way back to the time of King David and Samuel, when the God tells the prophet Samuel, I'm more concerned with obedience than sacrifice. I want to know you're following my commands. Don't just offer animals up to praise me, but your life, your heart doesn't really reflect what's going on there. So he's telling us that, religion has a lot to do with the things we say because it shows where our heart really is. Then in verse 27, he told us that's what bad religion is. That's vain religion. Well, what's pure? Hagnos. What's holy religion? He says, religion that is pure and undefiled before God and the Father is this: to care for widows and orphans, or orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. Now it's interesting because on page 19 of the handout, near the bottom, basically James is telling us, you deceive your heart, right? You deceive your heart, he says, if you believe that your worship and pious exercises of devotion are not accompanied by three things: a controlled use of your speech, helping the alienated poor, widows and orphans. He doesn't mention the third group, foreigners or aliens. That's because he's writing to people who are foreign aliens, right? They're in the Greco-Roman world, having been driven out of Jerusalem. So they are the third category themselves, but that doesn't deny them having to help others as well, even in their own affliction. And then 3, rejecting the ways of the world that would taint and compromise your faith. So keeping yourself unstained by the world. Because one of James's big themes is God versus the world. Where does our ultimate loyalty lie? So, again, what we see in James is simply a following of Jewish tradition through Jesus, where the central part of the covenant's relationship is the care for orphans, widows, and strangers. Right? It's for basically two sins that both the country of Israel and later the country of Judah will be destroyed. The two sins for which both fall are idolatry, so that's against God, but also the fact that they treat the poor contemptuously. They don't obey the Torah in what it required of Israel to be as the chosen people of God. And so these two were always sort of interlinked at some point. Once we stop worshiping the true God, we start to fall into a more worldly treatment of people the way that the ungodly sort of look at it. And so it's the same issues that James has here. Although for his group, he's not too much worried about idolatry in the strict sense, because they're Jewish Christians. They were Jewish before becoming Christian, and now they're Messianic Jews, but they've long had the history of Yahweh. So he's not really concerned that this is happening in the literal sense. He is concerned, however, though, that they're slipping into this, and by doing that, sort of in a reverse way, they're sort of rejecting God, because they're rejecting the covenant with which God has made with Israel and the church by their treatment of human beings. And so what James really has in mind here is the Torah of Jesus. And that is the Old Testament Torah and the Jewish worship of the first century. There were the Jewish worship of the first century mainly focused on their confession of faith, what they believed. Is called the Shema. It's based on the first word of the prayer, which was true of all Jewish prayers, and Catholicism carried that over. All our prayers are named after sort of the first line of the first word. The Shema is found in Deuteronomy 6. It's actually an extended version that they pray, but the basic of it is Deuteronomy 6. And this was prayed at least 3 times a day by pious Jews, and upon leaving and entering one's house. And so in Deuteronomy 6, starting with verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Therefore you shall love the Lord your God with your whole heart, with your whole being, with your whole strength. Take to heart these words which I command you today. Keep repeating them to your children. Recite them when you are at home and when you are away. That's why they would repeat it when they entered their house and when they left their house, not going anywhere. When you are away, when you lie down and when you get up, bind them on your arm as a sign and let them be as a pendant on your forehead. That's why later Jews would wear the phylacteries, the tiny little boxes that had written this prayer. That's what the woman grabs Jesus, the tassel, we call it. He's wearing those phylacteries. And sometimes you'll see Jews even today, especially the Orthodox, will wear like a little band that has a little tiny thing, and they have them. We'll bind them, so they took it quite literally. Bind them on your arm as a sign, let them be as a pen on your forehead. Write them on the doorposts of your houses and on your gates. So if you ever go in my office, as you walk in, on my inner office door, I have it. A little thing right there. It's Hear, O Israel. So that's the Shema. And it's basically, the basic focus of it is a confession of the one God. The one true God. And our loyalty to him. Now what Jesus did, and when I talked about James and Messianic Jews looking at the Torah through the lens of Jesus, what Jesus did, however, was add something very, very unique to it. Let's go to Matthew's Gospel just for one example. It's found in all 3 of the synoptics. John has different language he uses for the same thing, but in 20, I think it's 22. Yes, in chapter 22 of Matthew, verse 34. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a scholar of the law, tested him by asking, "Teacher, which commandment is the greatest?" He said to him, and he quotes the Shema, which that would have been the normal answer. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your soul, heart, all your soul, and all your mind." This is the greatest and first commandment. But then he doesn't stop. He says, "The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." Now that law is in the Torah. Jesus didn't make it up. It comes from Leviticus 19. But what Jesus does is he connects it sort of to the entire confession of faith as it's to be understood now. So it's not just loving God, but now absolutely and intimately connected with that and linked to it is the love of neighbor. He says the whole law and prophets depend on these two commandments. So he really makes them sort of one command. Now what we see as the church spreads out and begins the teaching of Jesus's his ministry and proclaiming the Lord, we see that the church takes care to really focus on some of these specific statements. For example, go in the letter to the Romans, chapter 13. We'll look at what Paul says in one place. Chapter 13, verse 8. Paul tells us, "Owe nothing to anyone except to love one another, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not kill, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other commandment there may be, are summarized in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no evil to the neighbor, hence love is the fulfillment of the law." Then again in Galatians, a few books past, in Galatians 5, Paul will say something very similar. In Galatians 5:13 to 15, almost the very end of his letter, he says, verse 13, "For you are called for freedom, brothers, but do not use this freedom as an opportunity of the flesh, rather serve one another through love. For the whole law is fulfilled in one statement, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." And you find it again in Peter. John has a slightly different one. John has a phrase, he refers to it as the new commandment. "A new commandment I give you, love one another." Remember that phrase? Yeah, and he uses it a lot. But notice, he calls it new. It's new because this part Jesus added. Yeah, it was part of the Torah, but it was not understood to be one of the defining sort of characteristics of what it meant to be a disciple of Israel, or in this case now of Jesus. So John refers to it always as the new commandment. But John, there's something odd that we begin to see, is that although we have two of them, and although Jesus himself did say this is first and greater, in practice, what the church is concerned with from the very beginning is this one. Let's look at one more passage where John makes it clear. Why is this the one focused on? Of the two, which both have to be held, but why is the church so concerned with looking at how this one comes out? Well, John tells us. In the first letter of John, chapter 4, so it's one of the last books of the Bible, 1 John, so it's one of his first letter.
Chapter 4?
Yes. And we'll start with 7, verse 7. He says, "Beloved, let us love one another because love is of God. Everyone who loves is begotten by God and knows God. Whoever is without love does not know God, for God is love. In this way the love of God was revealed to us. God sent his only Son into the world so that we might have life through him. In this is love, not that we have loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as expiation for our sins. Beloved, if God so loved us, we must also love one another. No one has ever seen God. Yet if we love one another, God remains in us, and his love is brought to perfection in us. Notice the similar terminology too, perfection. These are sort of stock Jewish terms. This is how we know we remain in him and he in us, that he has given us of his Spirit. Moreover, we have seen and testify the Father sent his Son as Savior of the world. Whoever acknowledges that Jesus is the Son of God, God remains in him and he in God. We have come to know and believe in the love God has for us. That first part is kind of his version of the Shema, although rather than focusing on God the Father entirely, he adds the whole aspect of Jesus. But even in that, notice he's already beginning to draw the connection. If God loves us, we have to love others. We didn't love God first. Our proof is everyone who loves is begotten by God and knows God. So it all focuses on the neighbor. But now he's going to make it really explicit as we come sort of to the end. God is love, and whoever remains in love remains in God, and God in him. In this is love brought to perfection among us, that we have confidence on the day of judgment. And that's, he hasn't mentioned a lot yet, but he'll get on the idea of judgment as well, that this is where salvation really comes from. He says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment, and so one who fears is not yet perfect in love. We love because he first loved us. Now, the last two verses are what kind of seal it and explain why Paul mentions only the second command and says that's good enough, and so does Peter. John says here, if anyone says, I love God, but hates his brother, he is a liar. And also, I keep reminding you guys this, but I think it's important. Hate and love are not emotional terms, right? So we can't think of it in that way. Hate and love means, do you serve or not? Are you active? Do you do things for? So if you're not helping someone, you hate them in Semitic usage. And if you're obeying someone and true to what you're required socially and religiously, then you love someone. It doesn't have an emotional connotation. It doesn't mean it can't also have that, but that's not what Jesus is talking about. In other words, don't let yourself off the hook because you don't have some emotion of hatred towards someone. No, being indifferent is what what John is talking about. So he says, whoever says I love God but hates his brother, he's a liar. For whoever does not love a brother whom he has seen cannot love of God whom he has not seen. This is the commandment we have from him. Whoever loves God must also love his brother. So James, we see now what James is getting at, and why Paul does it, and why the church focuses on this one. If you are serving other people concretely, and the reason you're doing it is because of your faith, then this is implied. Right? We know you love God then, just as John kept saying. We know that. How do we know it? Because you're doing what he asked you to do. That's how love is shown, obedience. That's how friendship is understood. However, the converse is not true, necessarily. I can say this, but it stops there. There's no necessary movement to actually now serve other people. I kind of just stay here in sort of my little white wall tower. Oh, I believe in God. And so that's why it's not that the church ignores this or doesn't think this is important. Certainly they believe it. James believes it absolutely. But this is what proves this. Where the converse is not true. I can say, word-wise, anything I want, but I'm going to be known by what I do. And John will say the same thing as James, but in a different way. He'll say, let us love not in word and something, in speech, but in deed and truth. So don't talk about it. Let's see how you really love. So James, John, they're all sort of following the same pattern. We see that in James, if we return to James, and he's just a few letters before John, 1 John, James calls this one out exactly. Remember, his community are Messianic Jews. They are Jews who have become believers that Jesus is the Christ. And so he can talk about the Shema to them in a way that Paul's converts don't understand it. They sort of learn it through different ways that Paul explains it. But go to chapter 2, and James starts, and we'll look at it in a few minutes, he starts verses 14 through 17 of chapter 2 by telling us it's not good enough to just tell someone nice words, right? You have to actually meet the need. So you have a poor person and all you say is, oh, God bless you, keep well. James says that's meaningless. And then, in fact, he says it's dead. Then he sort of introduces sort of a hypothetical. He says, well, someone says, you have faith and I have works. Now we have to be careful because by faith here, he means faith alone, confessional faith. He doesn't, and then by works, he doesn't mean that he doesn't also have faith. He just means works from faith. So it's a little confusing because James is not saying that works alone by themselves are good enough. No, we still need this. But he just sort of, that's his terminology. But he makes a real easy, concrete proof. He says, well, that's easy to prove. Demonstrate my faith to you from works, and you demonstrate yours to me from what you believe. Well, how can you do that if it's not through work? That's his point, is the argument is silly. And then he pushes it a little further in verse 19. He says, you believe that God is one. That's the Shema. Right? You believe that. He says, you do well. Right? You should believe that. But look at his response. Even the demons believe that and tremble. It's an absurd example meant to be absurd. Do the demons know more theology than us? Probably. Probably. Are any of them going to be saved? No. Because their actions, their lives, their existence doesn't reflect what that means. They know it. I mean, think when Jesus would cast the demons out, they knew exactly who he was. The Holy One of God. He silenced them.
Are they bad angels?
Yeah, the bad angels is who he's talking about, the fallen angels, the ones who fell before the humankind, probably. But his point that he's making in a very, very forceful way is simply having, I keep using the term confessional faith, that is, simply believing the right thing and saying it. That's what James is really talking about. That's not good enough because the gospel hasn't transformed you in any way. It hasn't really begun to transform you. Whereas this is, you could just call it faith works.
Transformational.
Right, we've been transformed, so we actually begin to live and do the things like Jesus. We begin to follow the law of God. We follow his will. Not just in sort of external worship practices and such, remember he said religion, but in actually taking that out into the world. I mean, remember, our whole worship service, the central worship service of the Catholic Church, comes from the last phrase spoken. That's the same word. Misa is the same word as mission or missionary. Go, it, but we in English we say you. Go, it the church. Go, it is sent. Where is it sent? Having just received the bread of the Eucharist and received Christ, we're now sent into the world to bring bread to the hungry, right? To serve. So even the entirety of the Mass, as we're worshiping and offering all, joining in Jesus' sacrifice of the Father and the power of the Spirit, even the Mass ends with sort of the declaration, okay, don't just go home now and let the Eucharist sit in you. Get out, right, and use it. So it's this absolute connection between the two. Again, we have to be clear, because of the later Protestant Reformation and issues there, we have to make sure we know what James is saying. He's not saying works by itself can do it. That's what Paul is railing against. But he's simply telling us the other side that Paul doesn't deal with quite as often, at least as explicitly so, and that is just confessional faith. Just, yes, I believe, I pray the creed all the time, and so on and so forth. It's this understanding that both kind of have to be together. And because of that, the great sin that James sees among, remember I listed those temptations, the great sin he sees is partiality. And James is going to go to great lengths to really hammer home to us the reality that showing partiality towards certain people as opposed to others is not simply a breach of etiquette, it is the breaking of the second commandment. It's serious, very serious. And so to show deference to the wealthy and dishonoring the poor, that's not just joining in your in that case, the Greco-Roman culture's hierarchy of status. It's actually to overturn the very commandment of the Messiah himself. And so that's why it's such a big issue. It's not, we're not talking about social mores. James is talking about what is the Torah of Jesus? What does he require and ask of us? And so a lot of it's going to be about that kind of understanding. And so leaving chapter 1, we're going to see that a lot of the themes he hits, how we speak, faith and works, he called it doers and hearers, wealth, all these things are going to keep popping back because they're his point. He just does it in what's called an elliptical way. It's a very Jewish way of writing. It's like the book of Revelation. There are 4 groups of 7 events. And the 4 groups of 7 are basically the same pattern over and over again as it's sort of each time it comes away and looks at it from a different angle. And so that's how James is going to write. So we're going to see he's going to talk about partiality and faith and works and the poor. And then chapter 3, he's going to go back to the tongue. And then he's going to go, he goes back and forth sort of highlighting between these things.
Question.
Yes.
Under Judea law, how did they treat their poor and or their orphans and widows, given that so much emphasis is here in James?
Right. There were a lot of rules in the Torah. Let's see. I think in chapter 2, when we go through, when I have the handout, we'll have some to look at. But for example, Deuteronomy, he says, if one of your kindred is in need in any community in the land which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall never harden your heart nor close your hand against your kin who's in need. Instead, you will open your hand freely and generously lend whatever suffices to meet that need. Be careful not to entertain thoughts such as the 7th year, the year of remission is here, so that you would begrudge your kin who is in need and give nothing. What it's referring to is every 7 years, all debt was forgiven. And so God through Moses is telling the people is, so don't get lawyery about this, right? Don't be like, well, I've only got a year for him to pay me back, and it's probably not going to happen, right? In other words, it's becoming quid pro quo. It's not just almsgiving. And so don't try to make this into sort of commercial thinking in your mind. He says, if that happens and you give nothing, your kin will cry to the Lord against you, and you will be held guilty. When you give, you must give generously and not with a stingy heart. And then he says something that Jesus kind of refers to himself later. He says, the land will never lack for needy persons. That is why I command you, open your hand freely to your poor and to your needy kin in your land. Never distort justice. Do not show partiality. Do not take a bribe. So that's one example. Other things they had were, if you took a poor person's cloak, like their clothing as part of their pledge, because remember, there's not a lot of money exchange. You had to give it back every night so that they wouldn't sleep in the cold, and then you'd have to re-get it the next day, but you actually had to give because it's their livelihood. Farmers and vintners were required to leave gleanings, like they couldn't harvest every piece, and the poor could freely walk through their fields and vineyards and take what was left to feed themselves. So those are just some examples. There were a lot in there. Even just the fact that widows, orphans, and aliens have the same rights as the native-born Jews, or the people of status. That it's kind of one of the first times in history we see sort of an equalization, at least in theory, of the law. That Roman law, one of the plebeians could not even sue a noble for anything. It was they didn't have status. And the rich didn't have to sue the poor, they just took what they wanted. And so you could only sue sort of equals. And so the Torah kind of brings it all together. So there's a lot of different ways. It's all over the Old Testament, but it was in the actions they did, what they had to do with food. The temple was given stuff that they were supposed to dole out donations. There was And then you had responsibility, especially
But they
if it
did
was
follow
a
the
family.
law, whether it was in their heart or not.
For the
right?
most
Because-
part, yeah. I mean, that's the struggle, is the prophets, when you read a lot of the prophets, part of the problem is as they're becoming more wealthy, they're really not doing that. And God had warned about that from the beginning. He said, look, I'm giving you this land, it's gonna be a land flowing with milk and honey, it's gonna be prosperous. Be careful. Once it becomes prosperous, don't think in your heart, hey, this is all because of me, right? I invested well, I did what, no. Don't forget that and think it's about you, because then you're not going to be freely giving. You're gonna forget you're a beggar just like they are. And so he had warned them, prosperity you have to be very careful about, because it can lead to a real serious problem. In the Proverbs, there's a great proverb. If I can find it really quick, I'll tell you. I think it's in chapter 30 of Proverbs. If we can't find it, I'll just sort of say it from memory. But in chapter 30, where is it? Yes, chapter 30 of Proverbs, verse 7 through 9. Here's what the wise man asks. 2 things I ask of you, do not deny them to me before I die. So this is a prayer to God. Put falsehood and lying far from me, so don't make me deceitful. And remember, James has already touched on speech, and he'll talk about a lot more. Look at the next one. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Provide me only with the food I need, lest being full I deny you, saying, who is the Lord? For being in want I steal and profane the name of my God. Right? Give me just enough. You give me too much, I'm going to get arrogant. You give me too little, I might turn to crime. I don't want either. And that's why when James comes out with his very first statement that wealth is a trial, I mean, he's in good hands. He's following the tradition of what it said. And so it's that fear that if you have too much, you start to think it's your own doing and you're special and it's your ability. And if you have too little, you might be tempted to have to take means into your own hands in immoral ways in order to sort of, alleviate that. And that's exactly what James is dealing with. The first 2 temptations I listed are some of the wealthy Jewish Christians are treating the poor Jewish Christians badly. Why? Because they basically brought the values of the secular Greco-Roman world into the church, and so they expect hierarchy and deference. And then you have some of the poor he's worried about that are going to take matters into their own hands and sort of, kill or violently take from others. And he's warning them. And then you have the third group who's kind of their own thing. They want all the benefits of having a wealthy benefactor, not realizing all the pitfalls and problems that will bring when you put someone in charge. Right? We never listened. Right? That was the Middle Ages. The house churches that were controlled by kings and dukes and nobles, right? You owned the church, you got its benefices. That means you got a collection of the money the church was given for your personal use. You appointed the priests, not the church, who worked there, all those things. The house churches were definitively one of the reasons it would eventually lead to the Reformation, because it was obviously, it was a horrible, horrible abuse. So it's always been a problem, and James sees it in his church already, that we have to be careful. We can't do the same things that the pagans are doing. And the patrons, the whole thing was very interesting, because the collegia, like the person themselves might not even believe in the God that was worshipped. They might just do it because they're trying to do it to make public fame and honor, because that was the whole Roman understanding, is it's all about honor. And so, we have lots of stories from the Roman historians and the poets who tell us all these wealthy people would bankrupt themselves, throwing the most ridiculously lavish parties. And then even in bankruptcy, they still had more honor than the poor, because it was all the social understanding of what you did. A lot of our terms today come from those. Like when we think about swag bags, your gift bags, the Romans invented that. The Superlia parties were that. You made bags, and they went and they were filled with different gifts for each party member according to how important that party member was. And then as, for example, once a year the emperor threw a banquet for all of Rome. Now, depending what status you were, was how much food you got, but everyone in theory was to be fed for the entire city. And on a smaller level, the people like Pontius Pilate, the procurators, and a group called the Decurions, they were required at least every 2 to 3 years to throw a similar party on the local level for their town. Could you imagine that? I mean, even in the small populations of that time, feeding like 4,000 people at your expense. So you can see money was a way to sort of impress your equals and even the ones lower than you. And that's what, but because of that, you exercised a lot of clout. In theory, the emperor owned everything. Everything was his. And then he, in turn, gifted some of it to the senatores, the noble families of Rome. These were all people of original Roman descent from the original city, like from the beginning when it first started as a power. They, in turn, would give their patronage to the equestadores. That's what all us attorneys are named after, right? Esquire. And then they in turn would have the plebeians, the poor, and the slaves. Who in theory, it was probably better to be a slave than poor. Because the slaves were taken care of, right? They're a financial investment. You were going to let them starve to death. And contrary to most of the movies you watch, they didn't beat them to death regularly or anything. That was actually against the law. So it was probably better unless you had a decent job because your life would be a lot more precarious. But then what would happen is, so each senator would have their equestadors, and so the senator would kind of bring him into their circle, right? So it would be like, oh, he works for such and such, you know? But then, when it's time, like I said, for a vote or anything else, then it all comes due, right? You get all yours to do whatever is necessary for me to pass what I want. Or even if it's a financial venture. The senators, I told you, could not engage in commerce, but they could, so it was a way around it. Well, I can't do it, but I'm going to support the money. You go do all the work, and then I better get the results I'm looking for. And this is called the patronage system. It's never between equals. It's always between a greater and a lesser. The patron is the greater, the client is the lesser. And to be honest, I mean, this system didn't die. When Rome fell, it became the basis of Europe's system, feudalism, right? The King of England owned everything, and he gave it to his dukes, and the dukes gave it to the barons, and the barons divided it among their knights. And in return, you had to offer, each had to offer troops, men for combat, and a portion of the goods, the agriculture. So the whole idea that the Western Empire of Rome spawned, it would exist for hundreds of years after its demise. But it set up this system. And Paul deals with it as well. It's really a problem because if you remember in 2 Corinthians, Paul is furious because in that church, he says, you're doing things that the pagans don't do. A man is in an incestuous relationship with his, it's actually his stepmother. But he has a relationship. And Paul is not only mad at the man for a horrible thing, he's mad at the church. He's mad at the church because they haven't excommunicated him. Why haven't they excommunicated him? Same as today. Well, he gives a lot of money to the church, Paul. I don't know, right? Yeah, we think it's bad, but we're not going to say anything because we might lose our cash cow. And Paul sort of orders them. He says, just so you know, I've excommunicated him by my authority. So now you better remove him from the church. And then by 2 Corinthians, they have done that. And so he invites the man back after repenting. But why wouldn't they, wealth, deference, right? Never here, thank God, but I've had priests tell me, but I've had priests tell me in my career times, maybe you shouldn't say that because it's offending certain people. Mm-hmm. We're talking about the gospel, right? Well, okay, why? Because we want to make sure they still are donors. I mean, it's sad, but it's We let it in, and that was the problem here. The other problem is these people didn't work as we understand it today. Our closest equivalent was basically they lived a stock market life. They didn't go to a job. The wealthy owned the land, and they owned all the means of production on that land. So anything that the land was used for, they just took a huge percentage. Like I said, 60 to 70%. Boom, it's theirs. And so Paul runs into the problem in his churches as well, because of that, they don't have a day job that they go to. Whereas the workers, there's no 8-hour work day like we've made in modern times, right? You work from sunup till sundown, if you can find a job. If you don't have a set job, if you're a day laborer, you work till the sun goes down. And maybe because we're not so clear about the culture, unless you're a wealthy person, you lived in basically what are apartments. Rome was mostly apartment type complexes, no kitchens. You bought your food on the street from vendors. That's where the whole street vendor comes from, is ancient Rome. And so what was happening in one of Paul's churches is that the original Eucharist probably was celebrated more like a full-blown Passover meal. That is, people brought all this food, and at some point in the midst of a real regular meal, they would stop, formally read the readings of the apostles, or in that time the Old Testament, and then the presider would come forward and they'd break the bread and they'd do the Eucharist part, and then the meal would be complete. Well, that worked fine in Jerusalem because Jews have a certain background of the Torah, but what's happening in the Gentile world, and now it's seeping into James's Jewish world, is that these people would arrive like 3 hours early with all their good food, their sumptuous feast, and their wine. And by the time these guys came 4 hours later with their meager food they had to buy to share, all the good food is gone and the wealthy are all drunk. And Paul is furious. He says, whatever you think you're doing, it's not the Eucharist. And we have that to thank for why our Mass is only the little part now. Right? It became too abusive by the wealthy, that they had to do something because it was clearly showing what Jesus didn't want, and that was hierarchy.
Where is that addressed is that Corinthians?
Yeah, it's Corinthians is where he addresses that particular one. Yeah.
Is that one of the ways that Martin Luther came to sola, only faith, sola fide, was because of the selling of indulgences to the, I'm curious
Right.
as to how-
He starts, Luther's initial impulse is the selling of the indulgences. Yeah, so the money, the church getting money. From that, it'll expand onwards. But yeah, a similar idea. He's struggling with the fact that the church is selling stuff, basically. For, in this case, it was for the building of St. Peter's Cathedral.
Yeah. But so then he completely leaves off good works.
Yes. Yeah, he kind of throws the
Yeah.
baby out with the bathwater, so to say.
Yeah,
Let's go ahead and take our break, you guys. But yeah, exactly. He gets rid of the good with